Today, we'll be addressing assessment of language for learning, which is pretty much those early school years, elementary school years. So at this stage, we as SLPs look not only at basic oral language skills, but also at abilities necessary for succeeding in school. So like I said, the chapter focuses on elementary school ages 5 to 12, but of course some of the kids in these grades will be functioning at lower level, and some students in middle or high school will be functioning at this level. This is the period of time when language is used for learning. So they are acquiring content through language. So rather than the period of preschool where they were actually learning language, now they're using the language they learned to learn content. Some states such as Rhode Island has passed legislations that kids 9 years of age and up will not receive services if their only issue is speech and language. So they would have to be receiving other related services to be able to qualify for speech and language as well. At this point, the family still needs to be involved in the process from referral to planning, and there may be some cases where the SLP will be the case manager and the parent advocate for updating IEP and etc. if speech and language are the only services being received. But in general, if there are other services, then there'll be an assigned case manager. But also what starts to happen here for children over 7, they may also be involved in the decision making. So they should be aware of why it is they're being assessed and what is being assessed and why, and how you're going to intervene and the kinds of things you would like to do with them. The older they get, the more involved they can get to. For identifications of the students that need communication assessment, of course, we're still doing screening. You can do standardized or locally developed screeners, but the standardized tends to be fairer, and your book lists a number of tools that you can use for this. The Flow-Hearted, the SELF, and the PLS tend to be very good screeners. A lot of times when you do mass screenings at kindergarten, we don't use formal standardized screenings, but we really should do, because the informal is not as accurate. And it's okay to not be too stringent to refer. So even if they didn't score fully 1 standard deviation from the mean, it may be okay to refer just because they're still going to receive a full evaluation. Now, of course, the screening process may be bypassed altogether, and the SLP can get a referral through the teacher or the parent. In a lot of cases for older school-age kids, the teachers may actually need some training to identify children who need referrals, because at this point their deficits are not as apparent, so their speech and language may sound fine to the naked ear. So you may need to ask teachers to do some checklists, sometimes just asking them to check for pragmatic difficulties. They can find some of the kids that are having difficulties in 1st grade, and the sooner you get to these kids, the better, because you still have time to work with them before they start to failing school. And of course, your book has a checklist that you can use to give teachers to do this. As part of the referral process, nowadays we have what's called a pre-assessment, and that's part of the student success teams, SSTs, or the responsiveness to intervention process, RTI. And those are accommodations that we try to have prior to referring kids to special education. So sometimes we try to make these accommodations to make sure that the child is getting what they need before they actually need to be placed in special education. The teachers are usually the ones that make these pre-assessment for kids who would benefit from RTI, and then the RTI team will make accommodations to see if they will help without needing special intervention. So it may range from something very simple, such as changing the seat to the front of the class, or it can be a little bit more involved. And as you do your RTI workshop, you will see that the RTI have 3 different levels of support, also called tiers. So for that first tier, it may be just a simple accommodation, such as changing seats. So then the team observes the child in class to see if they do okay with that accommodation or if they need more accommodation. So if they don't do okay at tier 1, they may go to tier 2, or they may have some more specialized, more focused help with school work to see if that's going to be okay. Again, the team is observing and assessing. If they're still not doing okay, they go into the tier 3 level, where they have even more support. And at this level, the SLP may actually be pulling kids into small groups to give them some special instruction and see how they're doing. And sometimes that will be enough for them to kind of catch up to their classmates. And if that still doesn't help, that's when they are actually referred for a full assessment. At this stage, again, some standardized tests may not be sensitive enough to pick up their difficulty because their syntax, morphology, and vocabulary may be okay. But you still need standardized tests for eligibility. So there are some tests that tend to be a little bit better for this age. Even though people tend to use always the same ones, it's important to have kind of a brief 5-minute conversation with the child prior to picking the assessment, so that you can get a better idea of where their weaknesses are and what the best fit would be. So for example, a lot of people use the OWLS, but it's really not that good for this age because it doesn't have any subtests. So if the child is having difficulties with a particular area, the OWLS may not be able to pick it up. The TOLD, or the test of language development, the primary is for ages 4 to 8, and the intermediate for 8 and up. And so for more advanced kids, I would definitely use the intermediate. And then the SELF-5 for kids from 6 to 18. It has a lot of different subtests that are very helpful. It does take time to administer those tests, those subtests, but it may be worthwhile. If you realize that there is a special difficulty, you can go straight to that particular test. Same is true for the CASEL. For this age group, there are 3 different types of tests that we can use. The ones we're most familiar with are the comprehensive batteries, such as the SELF and the TOLD and the CASEL. Usually, you just need to show below average performance in 1 or 2 subtests for eligibility, so you don't have to have a low score for the entire test. There are also some tests of pragmatics for this age group. It's kind of difficult to do standardized tests of pragmatics, but some tests do a pretty good job of it. You have the Let's Talk inventory for children, the test of pragmatic language, the test of language competence expanded, and the test of pragmatic skills. And then some of the tests, some of the comprehensive tests also have subtests in pragmatics, such as the CASEL. For Miami-Dade public schools, in general, you need 2 subtests below 1 standard deviation from the mean to have a child be eligible for services. The other type of test that we have is the learning related language skills, and so those are for testing oral language foundation for the classrooms, and so that would be the analysis of language for learning, comprehensive test of phonological processing, language processing test of awareness of language segments, test of early written language, test of relational concepts, test of word finding and discourse, and the word test. Criterion referenced assessments are very important for this age group because, again, the standardized tests may be not sensitive enough to pick up on their difficulties. So when you're looking at phonology, you're trying to figure out how robust the system is. It's not necessarily an articulation test, but more test of phonological processing. Some of the tests recommended are the Lindemood Auditory Conceptualization Test, or LAC, which uses small blocks to represent sounds in segmentation. The phonological awareness profile, the test of language segments, the test of phonological awareness. And the CEL-5 has a good subtest for rapid automatized naming, or RAN, which also is part of phonological processing, and it correlates well with reading ability. One thing you should do too is check for complex phonological production. So even though the child may not having any articulation difficulties, when you ask them to produce some multisyllabic words, they may still be showing some difficulties. If you do decide to do phonological awareness work, please keep in mind that the only thing that's really good for literacy is just the basic phonemic segmentation, sound blending, and letter sound correspondence. So if those are mastered, they're usually okay for literacy skills. You don't have to do all these different activities in phonological awareness to help them with literacy. For semantics and for other areas as well, we should be doing curriculum-based assessment and intervention. So making sure we know what it is that they need in the classroom, in their curriculum for success, and use that for our assessment and intervention. So for receptive vocabulary, for instance, we should use probes that focus on words needed in the classroom. So you can observe and note the vocabulary used by the teacher. You can check their textbook vocabulary, look at the glossary to see what words they need to know. And you may find some pictures to point to, or you can ask them to act out the vocabulary to see if they comprehend it. But your book has a good example of sentences with spatial terms that we can use that are important for following directions. So don't forget to test for that too. So here are the spatial terms. So you can have something as simple as having a piece of paper with a sticker in the middle, and you give them direction to make dots above the sticker, below the sticker, around the sticker, or use temporal terms such as make a noise after I say go, or before I say go, or while I say go, and connective terms such as if, although, unless, until. All of those are really important for literacy. For expressive vocabulary, remember that children may be able to use a word but not understand it fully. And also remember that the relationship between expressive and receptive vocabulary is complex. You would expect a discrepancy between receptive vocabulary, which is more that passive vocabulary that we really use on a daily basis, and the expressive vocabulary, which is what we actually do use. When you have a large discrepancy between receptive and an expressive, we usually suspect word retrieval problems. And you will see word retrieval problems when you have higher scores on standardized receptive tests rather than expressive tests. How much discrepancy is enough? A lot of the standardized tests now will tell you how much is enough to trigger a concern. So if you do the receptive one word and the expressive one word, for instance, you can compare the standard scores on both tests, and they will tell you if that discrepancy is big enough. Another thing that points to word retrieval problems is when you look at the fluency. So if the child is stopping a lot to think of what to say, what word to use, they're using a lot of fillers and revisions, that's usually a sign of word retrieval problems as well. And then the other thing we look at is lexical diversity by looking at the type token ratio in spontaneous conversation. For criterion referenced assessments of syntax and morphology, we also have to look at comprehension and production. Because a child may be able to produce a form, but really not be able to understand it when it's decontextualized, as it usually is in textbooks. Children with language learning disorders persist in using extra syntactic strategies to comprehend complex sentences. At this point, they should be able to interpret sentences syntactically only without needing any context, because that's necessary for text comprehension. So we do need to assess decontextualized comprehension of syntax, and we do that by putting more demands on the system to see where the breakdown is. One of the things we can do is a judgment of semantic acceptability. So you give them a sentence, and then they have to tell you if the sentence is okay or silly. You can have pictures for them to point at, a normal picture versus a silly picture, for example. And you can say things like the dog was bitten by the doll, and then they have to say if that is acceptable or not. And if they understand passive voice, they would know that this is not acceptable because a doll cannot bite a dog. You can also do judgment of appropriate interpretation, so you can actually give two interpretations and then ask which one is correct. So if you say the boy brushed his teeth after he ate his sandwich, you can do the actions and then ask them if you did them correctly. And then your book has table 11.5 that has center-embedded relative clauses that are fairly complex, and you can check for understanding of those two. We'll look at this in a second. And then if they are not doing well in the decontextualized tests above, just check to see what kind of errors they are making so that you can understand what kind of strategies they're using. Are they using probable event? Are they using order of mention? So you know what type of contextual support they are trying to use. So here are some of those center-embedded relative clauses that you can check for comprehension. So the boy who chased the cow was wearing a hat, and then you ask, was the cow wearing a hat? And the answer, of course, is no. Or the crook who ran from the police officer was carrying a bag. Was the crook carrying a bag? And the answer would be yes, for instance. Those are fairly complex sentences that takes a lot of decontextualization to understand. If the child is doing poorly in those decontextualized tasks, then you want to try to do some contextualization and see if they do better. It's a little harder to do because you need to set up a situation and observe what they're doing, but you know that you will have to start treatment at that contextualized level and then slowly move to more decontextualized language. For expressive syntax, the best criterion referenced assessment is just to do a language sample analysis. Usually you can do just an interview session. Don't use toys. Your book has some example questions that you can use for that. And you can check for things such as avoiding complex sentences, which a lot of the kids with language difficulties at this age will be doing. So here are some of the questions that you can use in that interview type language sample collection. Such, what can you tell me about your family? Are you in school? Tell me about it. What do you do when you're not in school? That should usually be good to get you a 5-minute spontaneous sample. For older kids, we analyze language samples by separating their utterances in what we call T units or terminal units or terminable units. And that just means any main clause with its subordinate clauses. So it's really just separating them into sentences. And this just helps because if you have a lot of coordination, such as and then, you always put those in separate sentences or separate T units. So if it is a complex sentence with subordinate clauses, you keep it all together. If it's just coordinated sentences, you just put them apart unless there is a co-referential subject in the second clause. And that just means that the pronominal subject was omitted. So if you say something like he ran into the house and turned off the oven. So when you say he ran into the house and turned off the oven, you didn't say and he turned off the oven. You omitted that second time for the pronominal subject, which makes it a one T unit, so that would be kept together. But if you had said he ran into the house and he turned off the oven, then you would separate those in two different T units. You just keep tallies of how many T units, how many complex sentences, for instance. There's really no standards for you to compare these two, but it's just it gives you some level of analysis for the complexity of the language they are using. So here's a simple example of a child that's saying a little bit of a narrative or a sample. Yeah, my little brother, he's a real pain in the neck and he's always taking my stuff and he never asks first and then he goes and loses it or breaks it, and so my mom yells at me when I slug him for it, but sometimes it's not so bad. So you see it's a big run-on thing, and we have to kind of div it up and analyze it, and when you look at terminable units, that's the way you get it. You know, number one is, yeah, my little brother, he's a real pain in the neck. 2, he's always taking my stuff. 3, he never asks first. So that's all, and you break them apart, and the and is in parentheses because it's considered a maze and it's not analyzed. And then for T4, you see, and then he goes and loses it or breaks it. You do not separate the coordination here because he is omitting the subject. So he goes and loses. You don't say and he loses. Or breaks it or not, or he breaks it. So because that pronominal subject is omitted, they are kept together as one T unit. And then T5, so my mom yells at me when I slug him for it. That's a subordinate clause, so they are kept together. So that's the way you would do T units. It's important for you to pay attention to this because this is, T units is something that sometimes is asked about on the praxis. If you don't have time to do a full language sample analysis, there are some shortcuts that you can do. You just check for common errors. You just do an analysis of complex sentences. So just keep tallies of which sentences are complex, and then you do a proportion. So if less than 20% of their sentences are complex, that's too little. That means their syntax is too simple. You can elicit complex sentences by using close procedures. So if you use verbs such as think, want, know, those are verbs that require a sentential complement so that they have to use a complex sentences. So if they are able to finish the sentence, you can get an idea of what complex sentences they can use. I'll show you the types of complex sentences that you should be looking for as a review in the next slide. But also remember, you should look at disruptions as a measure of syntactic ability. So kids who have not only vocabulary issues but also syntactic issues, they do a lot of disruptions, a lot of fillers, a lot of uhs, and a lot of talking around the word, circumlocutions, and so those are important to keep in mind as well. So here's a review of the types of complex sentences, and they are divided up into early and late appearing ones. You should be able to read through this and kind of identify the types of complex sentences. And always remember, a complex sentences must have 2 or more main verbs. That's how you know they are complex. And then to analyze speech disruptions, you look at things like pauses, fillers, repetitions, revisions, and kind of orphan phrases. And that gives you an idea of how disfluent, not disfluent in terms of stuttering, but in terms of speech disruptions, the child's discourse is. For pragmatics, at this stage, we look at two types of pragmatics, conversation and narrative. And narrative is considered part of pragmatics because when you tell a story, you need to take the listener's perspective into consideration, and that makes it part of pragmatics. But first, in terms of conversation, we look at three major areas of pragmatics: the range of communicative intentions, and your book has a table with the intentions that you should be looking for this age. You also look at whether they can modify register. For instance, are they able to use more appropriate, more polite language in appropriate settings, and also if they can manage discourse turns, topics, and breakdowns. Barrier games are a used way to assess pragmatic skills in all of these areas because you can check for presuppositional skills. So are they able to take the other player's view into account when they are making their game moves? So here's some activities for checking for some conversational pragmatics to see if they're able to request ice cream from different people, greet different people, persuade different people, and request information from different people. And then also for judging the appropriateness of what was said given all those circumstances. And here's a checklist that you can give teachers or parents or use for observations to see how the kids are using pragmatics in conversation. Now for pragmatics of narratives, we're looking at comprehension and inferencing. We know that children must have expectations or scripts for how stories will unfold, meaning knowledge of story grammar, but also they need to be able to make inferences. So we're also looking at their inferential ability. For checking for their literal comprehension, we can just ask factual questions about a paragraph or stories. But for inferential, we have to ask to explain why characters behaved in such a way, and feelings at different points of the story. And also you should be able to stop the story and ask what will happen next to check for their expectations. For narrative production, there are three types of context that we can assess, and they actually develop in this sequence. First, personal narratives, then script narratives, and then fictional narratives. Personal narratives is just relating something that happened to them. So they will usually use the pronoun I in the past tense when doing a personal narrative. So they may say, I went to my grandma's house yesterday, I ate some cookies. So that's a personal narrative. And very young kids can do that. Script narratives is a little bit more complex because they have a script. So it's like a sequence of events that's supposed to happen. So for instance, what happens when you get to your classroom? And you can say, well, first you have to put your backpack away, and then you have to line up, and you have to say good morning to the teacher. So you're using the pronoun you, and you're using the present tense most of the time. And then the most complex type of narratives are the fictional narratives, which is actually a story that a child needs to be able to tell, and that's really the most important one for literacy development. So when we assess fictional narratives, we're looking at three distinguishing characteristics. which one is overall maturity of the story, and that is part of what the story grammar or story macro structure is. So it's that big structure, also referred to as the coherence of the story. We also look at appropriate use of linguistic markers such as pronouns, prepositions, and articles. That's also called the cohesion of the story, or also the microstructure, so those little linguistic markers. And then at a third level, the use of precise and diverse vocabulary, and whether there's a high point or a climax in the story. So for story grammar, we went through this last time. Just as a reminder, the story will have a setting and then an episode structure. So a simple story may have just one episode, but more complex stories will have multiple episodes. And a full episode will have most, if not all, of these components: the initiating event, the internal response, the plan, an attempt, a consequence, and a reaction. Westby designed this fairly simple decision tree for looking at narrative macrostructure. He just answered yes or no to some of the questions, and you decide where you should begin intervention. So let's look at that. The first question would be, does the story have a temporally related series of events? If the answer is no, then the child is just giving you a descriptive sequence. If yes, then you ask, does the story have a causally related sequence of events? If no, it's just an action sequence. If yes, does the story imply goal-directed behavior? If no, it's a reactive sequence. And if yes, you ask, is planning or intentional behavior clear? If the answer is no, it's just an abbreviated episode. And if it's yes, you ask, is the story elaborated? If it's no, it is a complete episode. But if it's yes, it's actually a complex episode. It may have multiple episodes, interactional and embedded episodes. Leahy developed more comprehensive levels of narrative development. So the first level would be just additive chain, which is just adding one thing to the other. And then the second one would be temporal chain, which is a little bit more developed because events follow in a more logical way. Then next you would have a causal chain, where cause and effect relationships are apparent. And then the most complex would be multiple causal chain, where the story includes more than one causal chain or episode, so that you will be asking questions such as, were the episodes related in an additive or temporal fashion but not causally linked? Did any of the episodes provide the cause, effect, or motivation for another episode? So you should always, for stories at the causal chain level or above, so you know those subcategories contained in the story and in the story grammar, of course. Then to look at cohesion, or the microstructure, you are looking at those linguistic markers that bind the sentences together as an integrated discourse, such as pronouns, conjunctions, conjunctive adverbs, such as nevertheless, on the other hand, ellipses, and the article the. So for any of these words, the meaning can't be interpreted within the sentence. You have to go outside of the sentence, and that's why it's called discourse levels. You have some guidelines for looking at linguistic markers in a book. In general, kindergartners can produce cohesive ties about 85% of the time in their oral narratives, which is pretty good. And kids with language delays only do it about 60% of the time. So we should be looking at 70% of the time as a kind of a milestone. If they're not doing at least 70% correct, there's probably something wrong. So here is a procedure for scoring cohesive adequacy in narrative samples. It's a little bit fuzzy here, but you have this in your book, Books 1110. that can help you in doing that. Some additional notes on cohesion at the sentence level. You can also look at conjunctions, elaborated noun phrases, mental verbs, and adverbs. So you should know what's present or not and if it is appropriate for the child's age. So one good thing to look at is pronoun reference. If it's clear to you when a child uses a pronoun, if you can recover the person that that pronoun is referring to, that means the reference is clear. Then the third and more advanced way of looking at narratives is to look for that sparkle or high point. And for that, you look at the richness of vocabulary, the complexity of the episodes, and whether there is a climax. You usually get to this point if the child is doing the other two appropriately, the macrostructure and the microstructure. You check for richness of vocabulary, checking if they're using a lot of uncommon words, more literate types of words. And keep in mind the narrative development continues after age 7. And so you're going to be able to add multiple episodes, complex episodes, interactive and embedded episodes, and have two different points of view. So, and that's when this sparkle comes in as well. You have a sample analysis of a narrative in your appendix 11.5, page 479. This is a simple narrative task from a first grader. And here's an example of how to separate that into T units and look at the cohesive markers and their adequacy and the literate language style. Very important at this stage to start assessing what we call the metas, and that's the meta-linguistic awareness, being able to think about language. So consciousness of words, ability to segment sentences into words, and phonological awareness, making judgments about language form and content so they can edit their own work, analyzing language into linguistic units, manipulating those units, producing and understanding language play, and metapragmatic abilities, which is talking about appropriate uses of language in social skills. Again, your book has questions for assessing these skills. And here are some of the questions you can use to assess metalinguistic skills. Also very important at this stage is to assess their comprehension monitoring. So are you able to monitor what they are comprehending in the classroom and ask questions, ask for clarification if needed? And you can assess that by using barrier games. For instance, you give a purposefully unclear message or mumble parts of it to see if they ask for clarification. So let's say you are doing a barrier game where you're giving them instructions on how to draw something on the paper that will match the paper that you have, but they can't see the paper that you have. So that's the barrier. That's what makes it a barrier games. So let's say you have a circle in the right-hand corner of your paper, and you tell them draw a circle, and they may draw in the middle of the paper, and then you can call attention to it and say, I didn't tell you where on the page to draw it, so it doesn't match what I have. So they need to be able to ask you to clarify your instructions. It's important that they are able to understand what they are hearing and comprehending, so that they are able to identify where the breakdown is. So if they're not monitoring comprehension well enough, there's going to be breakdown in comprehension, and they are not going to be able to ask for clarification. So if they are doing that, it's our job to learn them, to help them learn how to fix those comprehension breakdowns by asking for clarification, for instance. Because what we do needs to be relevant to the child's academic career, our assessments at this stage need to be curriculum based, meaning we have to work with stuff that's important in their classroom daily lives. So we can do artifact analysis or portfolio assessments. You can examine their homework assignments, their work from class, projects, etc. Look at their writing samples, look for their level of narrative development, literate language style, and use of cohesion in those writing samples. We can do onlooker observation, which is just watching from a distance as the student participates in activities. You can also evaluate the demands of the classroom when you're doing that. And whenever you're doing observations, it's helpful to have a series of questions to ask so that it works as a checklist, and your book has an example of how to do that. And then beyond onlooker observation, you can do a participant observation where you are actually giving them some support to check for how much support they need. And that's kind of a dynamic assessment technique where the clinician works side by side with the student using scaffolding or contextual support and cues. And so you check for how much scaffolding they need, and if they do better with scaffolding, that means they're working within their zone of proximal development. And your book has some examples of dynamic assessment techniques that you can use for those participant observations. So here's your worksheet for guiding onlooker assessment of an activity such as spelling, for instance. And here's an example of dynamic assessment of metacognition using a Think Aloud protocol, which is a nice protocol to use with this age group. Now, some considerations for older clients at the language for learning stage. They're at this point not participating in regular curriculum, so they may be doing vocational and independent living programs. So, of course, there's no need to do standardized tests. The assessment will be all criterion referenced and observational. Make sure you use chronological age-appropriate materials and evaluate functional communicative needs that they have. And keep in mind that some fine points of language might never be mastered, so you need to focus on ecologically valid skills, meaning what's functional for them. Also keep in mind that any literacy skill is better than none, so whatever it takes for them to learn how to read and write a few things. Things that may be very functional for them would be reading recipes and directions. So if they are able to do that, that will help them tremendously. Of course, the assessments in this case will be very individualized for each client. For your video assignment, I posted 2 short videos on Blackboard that show vocabulary intervention activities. I thought it would be interesting for you to do how to work on vocabulary with school-age kids. But in addition to watching the videos, I want you to describe how you could use some of the same techniques demonstrated, but using a curriculum-based approach that we talked about. Please email me your answers. That's my email address, and include the answer in the body of the email instead of attaching a file. That makes it a little bit easier for me to read. Thank you.